Hey guys, this is Mr. Mahmood, and you're watching Homeostasis Lecture 3. Now, the first two lectures of this unit have been committed to the idea of homeostasis at the cellular level, how a single cell can maintain a stable internal environment, and how important the cell membrane is to regulating what goes in and out, and how the movement of water can coordinate size changes for the overall cell, dealing with the types of solutions you're in, and making predictions of what's going to happen to the cell. All of that is very, very important at the cellular level. This last lecture for the unit is really going to focus in more on the big picture of the more complex organisms, and we're really going to focus in on the human body in this discussion of how a complex organism such as ourselves, with 1 trillion cells in our body, can all function in harmony. And basically all these different components and all these different cells can work together because certain factors have to be stable all the time. So the human body is an amazing piece of work in terms of what it's capable of doing and how it's capable of keeping things regulated all the time. And just the slightest changes can cause serious problems. So there are a lot of factors and a lot of components in the human body that work to make sure that things stay the way they should. So we're going to talk about the basic driving force behind the series of reactions that allows things to maintain their regulation, to stay where they should be, through a series of reactions and a series of consequences that we call feedback loops. So we're going to talk about what a feedback loop is. There are two basic types of feedback loops that we'll cover over the course of the whole lecture, and we're going to specifically get into certain things that have to be regulated within our body in 3 very specific examples in terms of regulation of temperature, water levels, and blood sugar. So those are just 3 basic examples of things that have to be maintained at a very specific level throughout your entire life. We can go through a whole list. We can talk about blood pressure, heart rate, respiratory rate, all kinds of categories in making this kind of a discussion. I'll give you one example right now. Let's talk about a subconscious reaction of your body, something you don't usually think about doing, and that's yawning. Now, yawning is a very powerful thing. Why do you think people yawn? What do you think the purpose is for someone to yawn? Right? Just talking about it, just saying the word a few times, I might be getting you to yawn right now. It's highly contagious. It's something that your body is very prone to doing just from the thought of it. Have you ever thought about why? Have you ever thought about what value and what gain your body gets when you yawn? Think about it this way. Try to yawn without taking a really deep breath right before you do it. You can't do it, can you? Because that's what yawning gives you, is an extremely deep breath that takes in a whole lot more oxygen than your normal breath is typically getting. That's what yawning is really doing for you. It's helping your body maintain something called the oxygen saturation, or your O2 saturation. Your blood always should have a certain amount of oxygen passing through it, and sometimes it gets a little bit low. So if you can force a deep breath into your body, you're forcing a little extra oxygen, which will diffuse into your blood, and that helps you raise your oxygen saturation. It helps you get back to that normal level. So yawning really is just a way to quickly build up amount of oxygen back into your blood. It's something that your brain instinctively takes care of when it recognizes a problem and goes through what we consider a feedback loop to get the reaction going. So you can just think about it. Oh, just thinking about it makes me yawn. And it's a natural reaction because your brain always wants oxygen. Oxygen is a good thing for your brain. It's like money. If someone's offering it, you'll take it. That's why if you see anybody else yawning around you, or even hear the sound of somebody yawning, your brain registers that as, ooh, more oxygen, I want some. So it's going to do the same thing. So that's all yawning really does for you. Forces more oxygen in so you can take more of a breath. It's a very basic example of how your body is constantly working to keep things at a very stable level. And oxygen saturation is just one more example of those things. There's certain parts of your body that are able to identify when something gets out of whack, when something changes just a little bit, and those parts have incredible value and incredible importance for your overall functioning. Now, a lot of you guys already know the importance of the nervous system, and I think when we were doing cell analogies and things like that for my kids in my classroom, they were very often referring to the nucleus as the brain of the cell, because it's what coordinates and controls everything that goes on. And that's fine. And of course, a lot of people understand the value of the brain and the importance of the brain. But I think what you're doing, a lot of people do, is they connect the brain purely to the nervous system, which of course has very important functioning and coordinating impulses and responding to changes and any sort of a stimulus that happens on the surface of the body or in certain components of the body. However, there's another system that's critically important in helping your body maintain overall homeostasis that has components that are also stored in the brain, and that's called the endocrine system. The endocrine system doesn't get much praise because the nervous system kind of takes over for a lot of the discussion that you have, especially in your earlier years when you're first learning about body systems. But the endocrine system is critical for homeostasis. In my opinion, it is the most important system that your body has in order to maintain your homeostasis. The connector between the nervous system and the endocrine system is a tiny little gland called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, if you look at the diagram of the skull spinning around there, that animation, it's in red. So the hypothalamus is this little tiny gland that's right there in the very front part, in the top part of the brain stem. This single little gland is responsible for recognizing slight changes that happen in all of these different levels of your body. pH of your blood, the pressure of your blood, the oxygen saturation in the blood, the amount of water in the blood, outside of the blood, talking about your body temperature, your heart rate, your respiratory rate, all of those things are coordinated by your hypothalamus. Your hypothalamus is what recognizes any slight little change. So technically it's part of the nervous system because it's connected to how your body responds to any sort of stimulus, which a stimulus by definition is any kind of a change. So it's how your body responds to changes. However, the hypothalamus is then directly connected to another little gland, if you look carefully here, called the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is what's considered the master gland of the endocrine system because it's sort of the coordinator of the response. So a lot of times when we're going to talk about feedback loops here, we're going to be talking about what are called stimulus response reaction. The stimulus is the initial change, and that's usually, if we're talking about the human body, something that's registered by the hypothalamus. And then the response is first coordinated by the pituitary gland and then sent out to other glands within the endocrine system to eventually release all the hormones necessary to cause certain reactions to happen in your body to get things back to normal. So these two body systems are critically important when we start talking about maintaining homeostasis. So the whole idea of you yawning is recognizing that your oxygen levels are low. Yawning is usually connected to a certain feeling that you have. What feeling do you have normally when you notice that you're yawning a lot? You're tired, right? When you're tired, things don't work as efficiently. You're not working as hard at things. Energy is not being put into things quite as extensively as it may be when you're a little more awake. And the most important component of that in relation to yawning is your breathing rate and the depth of the breath that you take. When you start getting a little tired, you don't take as deep a breaths, which means the oxygen amount that's getting into your blood drops a little bit. So your hypothalamus registers, my oxygen levels are low. I need a deep breath in. So what do you think it forces your body to do? Take a deep breath, and it does that by yawning. So when you see other people doing it, again, it's the idea, oh, I want more oxygen in my blood, I'm going to yawn too. So it's all because your hypothalamus recognizes a slight change, and it starts a series of reactions that's the response that will eventually get whatever you need back to normal. This is an example of a feedback loop, and particularly is what's considered a negative feedback loop. I know you hear the words negative feedback loop, you automatically think of something bad, but a negative feedback loop is usually a very good thing. The basic difference between a negative feedback loop and a positive feedback loop is all in what the reaction is meant to do. If it's a negative feedback loop, the response that occurs after the stimulus is always working in the opposite direction of the change. So we're going to go over kind of some examples of what that means, but in a negative feedback loop, if the stimulus is in one direction, the response is in the opposite direction because the whole goal is to bring it back to its original level. If it's a positive feedback loop, then the response actually continues in the same direction as the stimulus. And again, most of the time, because we're talking about homeostasis, keeping things at a certain level, most of the feedback loops that happen in the body to maintain homeostasis are all about getting things back to their normal amount. So they're negative feedback loops. A perfect example of a negative feedback loop that's a little more functional that you guys have probably experienced on a daily basis, is dealing with an air conditioning or a heating system. So let's say that this is a thermostat that's set to heat. Let's say it's pretty cold outside. We're working into the cooler months now. Let's say it's cold outside, and I want to make sure that my house is a nice warm 74 degrees, just like you see here. So if and only if the temperature of the house drops below 74 degrees, will this thermostat actually trigger my heating system to start working. I'm not sure how much you guys know about this, but a heating or an air conditioning system is not just on 24 hours a day. It doesn't just blow out the air that you need 24 hours a day. If it's on heat, you're not just going to have warm air coming out all the time. It only starts releasing the warm air when it recognizes the need to do so. So it's all about a series of reactions. So if we're dealing with a cool night, temperatures are dropping over the course of the night, the moment the thermostat that's here in this system registers a temperature that's dropped below 74 degrees, that in itself becomes your stimulus. So the stimulus in this feedback loop is the thermostat that recognizes the temperature dropping below 74 degrees. So that recognition of the stimulus starts the response. The response is going to trigger the heating system to start releasing warm air into the environment of the room. So that warm air getting released will little by little increase the overall temperature of the room. And if that happens, the heater doesn't just turn on and never turn off, right? It'll only turn on as long as it needs to. And when I say that, that means it'll only turn on until that thermostat once again registers the temperature in the room has reached right at 74 again. And once it hits that 74 mark, it ends the negative feedback loop. Okay, so again, the stimulus is recognizing the temperature drop. The response begins by releasing warm air into the room. The warm air slowly increases the temperature of the room until the thermostat registers that the temperature in the room is now at its original setting, at which point it shuts off the feedback loop. And so the thermostat shuts off and the temperature in the room stays at that perfect 74 degrees until later in the night the same thing happens, and once again it triggers the same feedback loop again. So the stimulus recognizes the change, and the response is all to get things back to the original level, which is why we consider this a negative feedback loop. The response is in the opposite direction of the stimulus. Alright, so let's go through some actual examples of this. There are three particular examples that you're going to need to make sure you know about and you understand well. One of them deals with temperature regulation. We're going to talk about body temperature here. So let's say we live in Texas. It's very warm in the summer. Let's say it's the middle of the summer, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, something like that, and you decide to go for a leisurely run, right? Probably not the best idea. It's very hot, and your body temperature is going to start to increase for a couple of reasons. Obviously, you're just sitting in an environment where there's a whole lot of heat surrounding you, and internally, you're going to involve yourself in a lot of activity that's naturally going to cause energy because you're breaking bonds and you're naturally releasing a lot of heat anyway. So your body temperature is just naturally going to start to rise, right? You have an internal thermostat, just like your heating and air conditioning system, that registers the problem. That thermostat, ding ding, is the hypothalamus. Your hypothalamus, just like a thermostat on your AC system, is what recognizes your change. So the stimulus is recognized by the hypothalamus, which is technically your nervous system. That recognition will then trigger your endocrine system. So the message will then be sent from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland, which is your master gland of your endocrine system, to start a series of reactions that will ultimately bring your body temperature back down, right? So the initial recognition is your body temperature has increased more than it should, higher than its normal levels. So a series of reactions is going to start to happen. A few things happen that are very important for helping your overall body temperature go back down. But it's very important to understand something here. I don't know if you can notice this by the diagrams, but the endocrine system is not an interconnected system. It's not a system that can function completely separately of anything else. They're all just random glands, and they're all connected to random things, different organs, different parts of the body. They don't actually have their own connections to each other within the endocrine system. So instead, they depend highly on another system that sort of considered your highway system or your transport system of your body, and that's your circulatory system. So anytime hormonal messages need to be sent from one part of the body to the next, particularly from either the hypothalamus or pituitary out to the rest of the body, it's done through your circulatory system. So your circulatory system plays critical roles here. So in every one of these feedback loops we're going to talk about, this is a very common series of connections from the hypothalamus of the nervous system to the pituitary of your endocrine system, out through the circulatory system to wherever the next steps may be. So in this case, your body temperature is high. You're recognizing that it's high with the hypothalamus, sends a message to the pituitary. The pituitary then sends hormonal messages through your circulatory system to do a couple of things. One of them is directly connected to your circulatory system, in which it'll actually get your blood vessels to what's called vasodilate, or open up a little bit. Your blood is passing through these vessels, the arteries, the veins, the capillaries. As it's passing through, it causes friction. When it touches itself, other red blood cells, when it touches the surface, the internal walls of these blood vessels, all of that causes a little friction, which actually causes heat. So when the blood vessels are very close and compacted and constricted, there's actually more heat being created. Secondly, the closer you get to the middle of parts of your body, the warmer it actually is, for obvious reasons. And the closer you get to the surface of parts of your body, the cooler it actually is. So when your blood vessels actually open up a little bit, for a few reasons, the blood that's traveling through will actually become slightly cooler. So that's one thing that happens. Your blood actually dilates, or vasodilates. The blood vessels open up a little bit. You may notice this, especially if you have lighter skin or lighter complexion, more of a fair skin. You'll notice when you're hot, you really start to blush. Parts of your body really start to get pretty red. And that's actually because the blood vessels are opening up and getting closer to the surface of your body in order to allow them to be slightly cooler. So that was one thing that your body does to try to lower the body temperature. Another hormonal message that will get sent through will go all the way out to your skin cells, all throughout the surface of your body, and will start forcing a little bit of a contraction over these glands that have some water in them. They're sweat glands. And that little contraction of sweat will cause a little sweat to come out onto the surface of your body. And sweating actually cools your body because it's trying to get rid of a lot of that heat energy, and a lot of that heat energy really starts to develop right on the surface. So you want to get rid of that heat energy. If you can get some water on the surface of your body, it'll evaporate, and with that evaporation, it'll take a lot of the heat energy with you. So those two things, your vasodilation and your natural sweating, will both cause the temperature of your body to start to drop a little bit. So your hypothalamus recognizes a stimulus. It starts a series of reactions through your circulatory system and your endocrine system that will open up your blood vessels of your circulatory system and release a lot of sweat from your sweat glands in your skin, something called the integumentary system, which we'll cover a little bit later. And those two reactions will cause your body temperature to go back down. Now, once you start sweating, do you sweat for the rest of your life? No. When you start noticing you're blushed and you see your skin gets really red, does it stay red for the rest of your life? No, absolutely not. It'll only continue on with the cycle until your body is registered that the temperature has dropped back to normal amounts, at which point the feedback loop ends and it shuts off. So now your body is going to go back to its normal state. You'll eventually stop sweating, your blood vessels will sort of reconstrict back to normal, and you'll stay that way until the same thing may happen again and the cycle once again recontinues. This is another perfect example of a negative feedback loop. Or vice versa. Let's say it's very cold outside. If it's very cold outside, we're getting into the colder times of the year. Let's say your body's very, very cold. Again, your hypothalamus is going to register the change. It's your body's thermostat, so it registers the stimulus as the body temperature is actually dropping this time. It sends a message to the pituitary of your endocrine system. Again, sends a message out through your circulatory system. But one of the things it actually does is cause the blood vessels to work again. Instead of opening up this time, remember, it's slightly warmer the closer you get into the center, and the more compacted your blood vessels get, the more friction and heat that it actually causes as your blood cells pass through. So as your blood vessels this time will constrict, or vasoconstrict, that'll cause your blood vessels to cause a little more heat and be a little closer to the center of your body. So that's one way your body temperature will actually start to increase. That's why when you're really cold, your skin gets even more pale. Your blood vessels are going away. Your blood cells are getting closer to the center and further away from your surface. So you start seeing less of that flushed cell color on the surface of your body. So that's why you get more pale when you're cold. Your blood vessels are constricting. And another message gets sent to your skin cells, but this time instead of releasing sweat, the goal is to do what you can to try to keep heat from getting released out. So you have all these little pores in your body that naturally release out heat energy. So to try to constrict that and try to keep that heat energy from coming in, your pores will close. And a lot of times right in the middle of your pores is a hair, your body hair. When that constriction happens in your pores, the hairs that are naturally there point straight up. And now you're left with these bumps of your pores all throughout your body, or what we consider goosebumps or goose pimples or whatever you want to call them. Another natural reaction is your muscles will unconsciously start to contract uncontrollably. Your body won't be able to control these contractions, and that's your body shivering or shaking. And all of that is doing nothing but what your constricting blood vessels are doing, which is just causing heat energy to be produced. So you're making more heat energy that way. So all of these different things slowly get your body temperature back up, and once again, your feedback loop stops when the thermostat registers your body temperature back to normal. And only again, if it registers the stimulus as dropping again, will this cycle continue. So you see how this works. It's all about regulation. It's a negative feedback loop. The stimulus identifies a drop or an increase, some sort of a change. The response is always in the opposite direction of the change if it's a negative feedback loop. And ultimately gets things back to their normal amount, at which point the feedback loop shuts off and will continue to shut off until the cycle begins again. Alright, so that's an example of temperature regulation. Very important feedback loops that you need to know. Another example that you need to make sure you understand is how your body maintains water levels, proper water levels in your blood. It's very important that your blood has certain amounts of fluidity and a certain amount of water in it, all for pH, for the actual balance, so that enzymes and things that work throughout your blood can work properly. It's also very important for just making sure that the viscosity of your blood, the thickness of your blood, is a very consistent amount so that things can transport the way they're supposed to go. So water levels are critical for your body, and they have to be maintained at all times. So let's say that there's a scenario where you take in a lot of water. Let's say you drink, almost a liter of water by yourself for whatever reason. You're just thirsty, you decided you want to drink some water. Your hypothalamus, just like the thermostat of your body, is also the register of water levels. So your hypothalamus recognizes the change. This time your water level is too high in your blood. So it's going to start a series of responses. And again, these are all a negative response to ultimately bring things back to normal. I want my water levels in my blood to go down back to normal. So if I drink too much water, my water levels are now up. I send a message from my hypothalamus of the nervous system to the pituitary of the endocrine system. So now I'm in my endocrine system. The pituitary will then send out specific hormones through my circulatory systems to different parts of the body. In particular, it's going to send hormones called diuretic hormones over to your kidneys. Your kidneys are very important filtration organs for your body. They're the ones that pretty much control the amount of water that's passing through your blood. Water is absorbed by your small and large intestines as they're passing through your digestive system, but it goes to your kidney, and your kidney coordinates exactly how much of that water is going to get filtered out and how much stays into your blood. So in this case, if the kidney is receiving a lot of these diuretic hormones from the endocrine system, it'll register that it needs to try to filter out as much water as it possibly can. So diuretic hormones cause you to filter out more and more water. That water that gets filtered out of your two kidneys will pass through a tube called ureters to your bladder, at which point your bladder will start filling up with all that excess water and some salts and other things like that. Once your bladder gets so full that it starts to expand against the muscles around that bladder, it sends a message to your nervous system that you need to release that bladder, which means you gotta go. Right? You need to go to the bathroom. So you got to get rid of all of that excess water. And by doing that, your hypothalamus will once again recognize that your water levels have dropped back to normal, at which point the feedback loop shuts off, just like we've talked about before. We could also talk about the other scenario. Let's say that you were involved in some sort of activity that you've lost a lot of water in, like you're, again, out running in the middle of in the summer, or you're playing a sport where you sweat a lot. One way or another, your hypothalamus is recognizing that your water levels this time are dropping, and you need to get them back up to normal. So the same series of reactions will occur. You have the stimulus, which is the recognition of the water level dropping. Your hypothalamus message to the pituitary of the endocrine system sends through the circulatory system to the kidneys. This time, instead of diuretic hormones, they send out things called anti-diuretic hormones, or ADH. A good example of this is something called vasopressin. It's an anti-diuretic hormone which actually tells your kidneys to not filter as much water. because it's recognizing that your water levels are already a little low. So you don't want to get rid of water, you want to try to keep water as much as you can. So by using antidiuretic hormone and getting that to the kidneys, less water gets filtered out. So this time, you don't necessarily go to the bathroom, and that water will actually try to be refiltered back into your bloodstream as much as possible, for whatever reason, because your body recognized your water levels started to drop. Both of them are negative feedback loops because the stimulus is in one direction, the response is in the opposite direction of the change, so things can get back to normal. Alright, and the last specific example I want you guys to know about is blood sugar regulation. Your body, I think we've talked about this already, is very much dependent on sugars, particularly things like glucose, fructose, galactose, in order for your mitochondria in your cells to be able to go through aerobic respiration and produce all of that ATP that's needed for the activation energy of all of your chemical reactions. You see how I just connected about 6 different lectures all in that single statement, right? You see how biology is all connected. So it's very important that you have a very consistent amount of blood sugar in your blood, so that the right amounts of sugar can always be available for your cells that need it to turn around and make their own ATP. So blood sugar regulation is, again, a very important component. This is something, once again, that's recognized as a problem if it goes too high or too low by your hypothalamus. Your hypothalamus, again, comes through in the clutch for you. It recognizes if your blood sugar level gets too high or low. So let's say now this time that we're getting close to Thanksgiving. Let's say it's a Thanksgiving dinner. You go for all the fixings, all the trimmings, the whole thing, the whole works. You're eating more than you probably eat on any given day in a single meal. So you're taking in a whole lot of nutrients, which includes a whole lot of sugar. Your hypothalamus recognizes now that your blood sugar levels are going to start to peak. They're going to go way high because all that sugar is getting broken down and again being diffused out through your small intestine into your bloodstream. So now you have way too much sugar in your bloodstream. Hypothalamus recognizes the change, sends a message through your circulatory system, this time to your pancreas. Your pancreas is critically important for blood sugar regulation because it produces 2 hormones that each play important roles. One of the hormones is called insulin, which you guys have probably heard of before. Insulin is responsible for helping get your blood sugar levels to drop. So in this case, your blood sugar levels are too high because you ate a heavy meal. So the circulatory system transports a message from the pituitary through hormones to your pancreas. The pancreas is going to start producing more insulin. And that insulin is going to force a couple of things to happen. One, it's going to open up your cells and the openings that will allow the sugar to move in. Basically, these are channel proteins that it opens up for the cells so that the sugar can be passed more into the cells quickly. That'll help get some of the sugar out of your blood. It'll also take a lot of those sugars, that excess sugar, and it'll start combining them together through dehydration synthesis to start producing a starch known as glycogen. And that glycogen will get stored away in your liver. So if your blood sugar is too high, a couple of different things will happen because insulin is being produced by your pancreas that'll help get the overall blood sugar to go down back to normal. Either because it's being flushed into the cells because you're opening up the channel proteins to allow the sugar to move in, or the excess sugars are combining through dehydration synthesis to make glycogen to get stored away in your liver. Once your blood sugar gets back down to its normal levels, again, the feedback loop ends and we're back to where we started. Now, vice versa, if let's say I go a long time without eating, let's say I skip a meal or a couple of meals for whatever reason, my blood sugar little by little is going to start to drop because again, every one of my cells still needs the energy. So they're going to pull the sugars into the mitochondria so they can break it down to make ATP. So little by little, if I'm not putting more sugar in, my overall blood sugar starts to drop. Again, my hypothalamus registers the change, sends hormonal messages through the pituitary, the endocrine system, down to the pancreas through your circulatory system. Your pancreas will this time start producing another hormone. This one's called glucagon. Glucagon is a hormone that will help get your blood sugar levels back up. So in this case, I want to get some of that excess sugar that I stored away in my liver. So it's actually going to send a message to your liver to take those glycogen chains, those long starches that were made, and actually go through hydrolysis, break them apart back into the original sugars, and flush them back into your bloodstream. So that alone will help get those sugars back into your blood so that the overall blood sugar levels can get back to normal and your cells can function the way that they're supposed to. So again, both of these are negative feedback loops. If your blood sugar is too high, your message will ultimately get your pancreas to secrete more insulin. That insulin will store a lot of that excess sugar in your liver as glycogen and flush a little extra into your cells. If it's too low, the message this time that goes to your pancreas will cause it to produce glucagon. The glucagon is going to pull from those reserves that are in your liver, break the starches back up to original sugars, and get things back to their normal amount. Either way, the feedback loop shuts off when things get back to their normal levels. So all of these are perfect examples of negative feedback loops. And blood sugar regulation, of course, can have its problems. There's a very particular disorder that comes with the imbalance or improper production of these hormones that are in the pancreas, particularly the production of insulin, which hopefully you guys are aware of as diabetes. Now, there are two types of diabetes that can occur. Type 1 diabetes is a genetic disorder where the insulin-producing cells that are found in your pancreas are just malfunctioning. They don't naturally function properly, so you just don't make as much insulin as you're supposed to, which is a serious problem because if your blood sugar level gets too high and you don't have enough insulin being produced, your body doesn't know to take those excess sugars and store them away and flush them out, so instead it starts filling up within your bloodstream and it blocks passageways and makes it very difficult for things to get where they're supposed to go, and it can become a very serious problem if your blood sugar level is too high for an extended period of time. So your body has to do something to react to it, and modern medicine has developed ways to actually produce a whole lot of insulin in a lab, which we'll talk about in a few units, that allows you to inject the insulin so that one way or another your bloodstream gets the message to flush away all that extra sugar, store it away in your liver, get it into your cells so you can get things back to normal. Type 2 diabetes, however, usually has a lot to do with environmental factors. If your body is just overworked in this process, you're constantly eating heavy sugar diets, the diets that you're eating, taking a whole lot of food, you're eating a high calorie diet, and you're eating always kind of have a high sugar intake, your bloodstream is constantly working in this feedback loop, consistently is working to try to keep your blood sugar level down. So your pancreas is just almost constantly secreting insulin. Just like anything else, if you're overworking certain things, they start to wear down. So if you're talking about type 2 diabetes, that happens over time because your insulin secreting cells in your pancreas just give up. They're just working so hard, they're just overworked. Eventually they get to the point where they can't make the kind of insulin consistently that they're supposed to, and then you have the same problem. You're not naturally able to control it. You have to start injecting the insulin whenever your blood sugar gets too high in order to get things regulated. So that diabetes comes with a problem in this feedback loop, typically because of something with the pancreas. Those pancreatic cells can't produce the insulin that they're normally supposed to produce naturally. One key thing you need to understand here with every one of these feedback loops is it deals with something called the interdependence of body systems. Interdependence means the dependence of body systems on other body systems, how they connect. Inter means two things connecting together. For example, interstate highways are highways that connect one state to another. So all of the interstates go over a state border, whereas intra-state highways are highways that are just specifically within the state. So that gives you a little idea. So interdependence of body systems means body systems working together, and just in these feedback loops alone, just blood sugar, we talk about the nervous system, to the endocrine system, to the circulatory system, to the digestive system, all working together to help get things back into their original amounts. All these functioning together. Water retention, we talk again about the nervous system, to the endocrine, to the circulatory, this time to the excretory with the kidneys and functioning in together. With body temperature, we talk about nervous system to the endocrine system. You guys see a pattern? Nervous system to the endocrine system, to the circulatory system, and then to the integumentary system in order to either release sweat or to contract the pores one way or the other to help things get back to normal. So all these systems are working together in order to maintain homeostasis as a whole. All right, so it's very important. So besides just an understanding of negative feedback loops, I also want you guys to understand that there are some examples of positive feedback loops. And as ironic as it may sound, they actually help your body maintain homeostasis in the long run. Even though in the short run, it seems like they're going way outside of normal. So there are a few examples that I'm going to give here. The first picture there you see on the left, I'm not sure how many of you will be familiar with this looking at it, but this is what's called a breast pump. So this is what mothers use to help pump some breast milk so that they can have it ready when their babies need their milk. So milk is something that's not naturally produced by the ladies, and I'm sure That comes as a surprise to some of you guys, but not all ladies produce breast milk for their entire life. In fact, none of them do. They only do it when their body recognizes the need for that breast milk, and it's being released because of very specific hormones that get sent to that part of the body, and particularly one called prolactin. Prolactin is a hormone that starts causing the lactation process in the breast cells that actually starts releasing the milk. That doesn't happen all the time, and it only happens when very specific hormonal messages are combined to cause that change. So the change is again going to be the production of a little bit of milk through this prolactin. The normal reaction, if this was a negative feedback loop, would be to bring things back to normal and to stop the milk production. But in reality, once the milk starts being produced, the prolactin levels will actually continue to increase, which means the response in this case is actually in the same direction as the change. So this is a very good example of a positive feedback loop. And if a mother that's breastfeeding can only continue to breastfeed for as long as she purposely continues the production of milk, which means as long as the baby is pulling that milk out, more milk will replace it. Once the mother tends to stop breastfeeding the child, there comes a point that because the milk isn't being pulled out of the breast, milk is not going to continue to be produced. And eventually the process of producing this milk will actually stop. Prolactin levels will drop as more and more gets kept in the breast. So if the baby is not continuing to take the milk out, prolactin levels slowly begin to drop and get things eventually back to their normal amounts. But if the baby is continuing to pull out that milk, the prolactin is continuing to be produced, and that positive feedback loop continues. So a mother could potentially breast milk for years. And it's just a matter of when the mother stops having the baby pull the milk out of her breast that the actual prolactin feedback loop, this positive feedback loop, stops. All right, so a positive feedback loop is a good example here of producing something that's out of the ordinary, but instead of going back to normal, it just continues to produce it, because in this case, this is something that the human species has recognized as a need to continue on outside of normal for a while in order to provide something necessary for the next generation. Another great example, if you see these pictures here on the left, are these are pictures of different kinds of cells. In particular, the ones that are more circular are white blood cells, or immune cells, cells that are responsible for your immune system and fighting off diseases. These immune cells don't naturally get produced in high amounts. You normally only have a few of them within any given milliliter of blood. However, when your body recognizes a threat, some sort of a disease like a virus or a bacterial infection or something like that, it triggers, the stimulus is going to be to trigger these white blood cells to start making more and more of themselves. So instead of just having a few in a milliliter of blood, which is normal, you start producing thousands or hundreds of thousands within that same milliliter of blood. So that massive overproduction of white blood cells is definitely an example of a positive feedback loop. You start producing more cells than normal. The natural reaction would be to shut that off. But in this example, because you want to start making as many of those immune cells as possible, so you're basically building your army to fight off the infection, you want as many soldiers as possible. So you're going to continue this positive feedback loop, making more and more of these immune cells so that you can fight off the infection. In the short term, it's a positive feedback loop, but ultimately, you're fighting off an infection so things can get back to normal. So ultimately, it is negative, and that's why these both will help overall maintaining homeostasis. But in the short run, the response is in the same direction as the change, which means this is something I would consider as a positive feedback loop. So remember these two examples of good examples of positive feedback loops, which is an example of the response being in the same direction as the change. Whereas negative feedback loops are the more common examples, where a response is in the opposite direction of the change to bring things back to normal. All right, so these are all good examples of feedback loops, all good examples of the interdependence of body systems and how different body systems work together to maintain your overall homeostasis. The last basic thing I want you to understand, we're going to spend a lot more time on this when we talk about the different cells of the body, when we get into cell reproduction and division and everything else. But it's very important to understand that all of these cells perform the functions that they do because of the basic structures that they have. It's very important for the overall understanding of a feedback loop and seeing how one part of a body works against the other to see how each one has its own critical role to play because of the way it's structured. And a lot of times you're going to see that it has to do with increased surface area to allow things to happen. For example, you see the picture at the bottom left there. Those are what we call villi. This is what lines the internal membrane of your small intestine. So when it comes time for you to diffuse out all of the nutrients and the water and the other things that are eventually going to get into your blood to get sent out to your cells so you can function properly, the more surface area you have, the more area there is for diffusion to occur, which means more nutrients being passed into your bloodstream. So because the villi are not flat and they have ridges, those ridges allow for more diffusion to happen. So this is also something that's important in parts of your lungs, for example, your alveoli, the little tiny air sacs that we'll talk about, have an increased surface area. The top left picture, this is a picture of a neuron, which is responsible for sending and receiving impulses from all the different parts of your nervous system up to your brain and then back out. Again, that has all these little extensions and branches as well. Each one of those branches can take information and send those out. So those, again, increase surface area and allow your cells to function. In your bone, your skeletal system, you actually have blood vessels that travel through your bone, through the compact, really dense part of your bone, because you actually make blood cells in your bone, and they have to have a way to get into your bloodstream. So because of the structure of where they are, they allow your body to make the blood cells and send it to your system. Muscle cells, you see there are different types of muscle cells. Each one plays very critical roles, and it's their structure that allows them to perform the very particular functions that they perform. So again, we'll talk about all these examples later, but it's very important to understand when we talk about the overall maintenance and homeostasis of the body systems have an interdependence to each other, and independently, each individual organ, each individual system functions the way it does because of its particular structure. And without the structure, you can't allow for the series of responses necessary to get a stimulus back to its original amount if it's a negative loop, or to continue in the same direction if it's a positive loop. So I hope you took this all in pretty well. This is going to start making much more sense as we continue on throughout the year and start really making these connections to your own life, your own human body, and seeing how all of this idea comes together. Homeostasis is what keeps us alive. It's one of the 8 characteristics of all living things. If you can't keep a balance, you can't keep things steady, enzymes don't work the way they're supposed to, chemical reactions don't happen the way they're supposed to, and your body just cannot function. And ultimately, we never yawn again. So, hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll see you guys next time.